Everyone, Matthew DeSantis here with NYRA Bets, here with your Breeders' Cup Classic Contender Spotlight videos, and this one is on Fierceness. Now, before we get to this Contenders video, make sure to press that like button and subscribe on the NYRA Bets YouTube channel. Subscribing is completely free of cost and just notifies you whenever new videos are dropping, and we have a lot up here on the site already. We have trainer-specific videos for the top trainers and their 2024 list of contenders. We also have these spotlight videos for the Breeders' Cup Classic. In addition, we will be having a capping the card focused on Juvenile Friday, a separate one focused on Classic Saturday. We will have some long shot videos as well this week. We're going to have a lot of content here for you on NYRA Bets YouTube, and also make sure to follow us on X at NYRA Bets, because I'll be on site at Del Mar sharing a lot of content, getting opinions from other people, and all that good stuff. So like I said, make sure to like and subscribe today. Well, like I said, we're going to talk about Fierceness in this video, and he is an enigmatic horse. He is a horse that sometimes turns in dazzling efforts, other times turns in head-scratching efforts, but he has emerged now as likely the top 3-year-old contender in this Breeders' Cup Classic. He will be among your top choices on the board from a betting standpoint. He and City of Troy and maybe Forever Young will probably all vie for favoritism in this particular race. I'm thinking you'll probably get somewhere between 5-2 and 7-2 on a horse like Fierceness come post time, because that American money is going to come in. I know the overseas markets are very bullish on City of Troy, but once the American money starts coming in, I think it might change the lines a little bit as we get closer to post time. But let's talk a little bit more about Fierceness if you're not as familiar with this horse. If you're just kind of a casual fan tuning into the Breeders' Cup, wanting to find out who to support in the Breeders' Cup Classic, there's a lot to like with Fierceness. He is a very accomplished horse, and he is one that trained by Todd Pletcher, who obviously brings a lot of horses out to the Breeders' Cup every year. As we covered in the Pletcher-specific Countdown to the Cup episode, looking at his historical success, he does not necessarily have a very high win percentage at the Breeders' Cup, only about 8.5% or so. So it's to some extent a byproduct of his success. He brings so many horses to the Breeders' Cup over the years that it ends up being difficult, I think, for him to be able to have a much higher win percentage. Some people thought I was kind of knocking Todd Pletcher or Mike Rapoli. Quite the opposite. It is a product of how good of an operation they have, that it's a good problem to have. They have so many horses that it's difficult for them to win all of these different races. And so, listen, Pletcher, though, very accomplished trainer. You have John Velasquez up on the mount, and Johnny V, I think, fits this horse very well. John Velasquez is a jockey. There are few jockeys I trust more on a horse that has great early speed than John Velasquez. He is a master at knowing how to get horses to relax, to get them up front, and to be aggressive. And that's what you need out of Fierceness, both to be aggressive, but then to get that horse to relax a little bit once the race gets underway. Sired by City of Light, Dam is Nonabella. Obviously, very strong connection there to Rapoli Stables. And Mike Rapoli, the owner, very outspoken man, but quite frankly, I wish we had more owners like him in the sport, because he is someone who certainly brings a lot of visibility to the issues, the problems, but also highlights the great successes in our sport as well. Now, on the track, Fierceness has done a lot of good work. He is a 3-time Grade 1 winner, winning the Travers most recently, winning the Florida Derby earlier this year, and then going back to last year, going out to Santa Anita and absolutely romping in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile by over 6 lengths that day. And I think that is notable for one important reason, which is it showed that he can ship to the West Coast. Not all horses can do that. Not all horses like shipping across country and bringing their A game when they do so. But the fact that he did it as a 2-year-old, I think, really speaks highly of him. And remember, that was coming off a very disappointing performance in the Champagne right before that. So this is a horse that, again, has a ton of talent, has shown the ability to travel out west, run well on the West Coast, will be running at Del Mar for the first time, obviously, but has started to maybe find his groove after a disappointing Kentucky Derby, coming back and winning the Jim Dandy, grade 2, and then winning the Travers in back-to-back races, and certainly coming in very good form. And you'll see his overall form, and you'll see what everybody was fearful of going into the Travers, which was this every other race dynamic. That when you look at Fierceness, he dazzles and then he disappoints, and then he dazzles and then he disappoints. Now, I think that might be an oversimplification of his racing form, because I think if you look at that second start in the Champagne, sloppy sealed track, bad weather day in general. And while he did win over a muddy sealed track in debut, the weather was really not that bad. Weather was not great that day at the Champagne, and doesn't run well. Also lunges out of the gate, has some issues at the start, and is behind immediately. And I think any 2-year-old would probably have run a very similar race to him, given those dynamics. And so I can easily forgive that. He comes right back a month later, goes out to Santa Anita, wins the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, as I said, in a dominating effort with John Velasquez aboard. Then he goes to the bench, and he goes to the bench for about 4 months, comes back in the Holy Bull and runs third. Now, it was a disappointing effort because he was a heavy favorite that day. But I think it's a couple of things to point out. One is when he broke out of the gate that day, he was kind of sandwiched between two horses right away. I know some people thought maybe he got the wind knocked out of him, that he just kind of, encountered an obstacle that maybe he didn't quite expect. I will say he never at any point looked comfortable in that race. He was traveling wide. They were going really slow up front, too. They basically went 25 and 50 to the quarter and a half, which is incredibly slow on the dirt at Gulfstream Park for that race. Race was, like I said, kind of an oddly run one, and won by Hades. And like I said, he didn't run particularly well. Then he comes back in the Florida Derby and wins that grade 1 going away. Now, a critic would say that was not much of a grade 1 race. That when you look at who else was in that field, it was pretty light. That looked to be more of maybe a listed stakes caliber field looking back on it, maybe even an allowance caliber field. But nevertheless, he dominated it, won by over 13 lengths, and looked like the old Fierceness. Or as Pete Aiello, the track announcer down at Gulfstream Park, said, the real Fierceness. So certainly he looked the part. Comes into the Kentucky Derby, and we're right back to the same on, off. But it's the Kentucky Derby. Most handicappers will tell you that when you evaluate any 3-year-old, you always are willing to draw a line through the Kentucky Derby. It's one of the flukier races that we have. These horses will never run against this many horses again in their careers. They're going a distance they've never gone before in terms of 1.25 miles. The pace is insanely hot usually. And not surprisingly, Fierceness faded. He was up on the lead, hung wide, had that 16 post, which I think we'll get to in a second, may not be the worst of all things. But like I said, just faded late. And honestly, outside of Mystic Dan, anybody else who was anywhere near the lead faded back that day. So again, you could maybe make an excuse. Comes right back and has a little bit of a layoff. It goes from the beginning of May until late July, and had been pointed towards the Belmont, but wasn't training particularly well. And his stablemate Mindframe actually was training a little bit better. And so Mindframe ends up going to the Belmont. Fierceness goes to the Jim Dandy and runs a big race and ends up beating Sierra Leone. And again, we go back to that on, off. Here's the thing, though. He needed some time off. It was pretty obvious watching his workouts after Kentucky Derby when he was potentially getting ready for the Belmont that he was not back to his old self at all. He needed time after that race. That Kentucky Derby took a lot out of him, it appeared. And the other thing to mention about Fierceness is physically, he's not the most intimidating horse. He's not imposing by any stretch. I'll tell you who's imposing is Sierra Leone. When you go in the paddock and you look at Sierra Leone, you go, man, that's a racehorse right there. Fierceness walks in, you're going to go, really? This is Fierceness? He isn't the biggest of all horses. And I remember I picked him in the Jim Dandy to win, and partially because of that on, off thing. And also I thought he would benefit from the layoff. And that was my pick. I was going to stick to it. But I'll be honest, I was in the paddock that day at Saratoga, and Sierra Leone walked in, and 2 seconds later, Fierceness walks in. And I thought to myself, yikes, I don't know if I made the right choice here because Fierceness really didn't look that great physically. And yet he ran a huge race and won. Comes back in the Travers, and everybody's fading him at this point. I mean, everybody's going, well, the on off thing. But one thing I will say, and I certainly did not pick him that day. I picked Sierra Leone, who finished third. And one thing I will say about Fierceness, though, is everybody was focused on Torpedo Anna paddock schooling the week ahead of the Travers up at Saratoga. And she was incredibly impressive. And I told anybody who was willing to listen, she certainly looked the part. And one of the things that kind of flew under the radar was Fierceness came out and paddock schooled the one day. He looked better 3 weeks after the Jim Dandy than he did on the day of the Jim Dandy, in my opinion. He looked like he actually put on good weight after a race. And that was something that he had struggled with at times, was putting on and maintaining good weight. And he was never the biggest horse. He kind of developed quickly as a 2-year-old, but didn't necessarily take that big maturation step forward at 3. But he finally looked like he was filling out more and putting on really good weight ahead of the Travers. I thought he looked better on Travers Day than he did on Jim Dandy Day. And he goes out and runs just an absolutely massive race in the Travers. And we're going to show that race. And I want to show by the start, because I think there is a misperception with Fierceness that somehow he needs to have the lead. I think one of the things that is important with Fierceness is his post position. I would argue he is maybe the most post-dependent horse in the race, or at least the most post-dependent of the major contenders in the race. I think a horse like Tapit Trice might be a little post-dependent. City of Troy in his own way might be, but he's such an X factor that it's hard to discount one way or the other. I say that because one of the things that's obvious about Fierceness is that he likes to be on the outside, and he likes to, if he can't get to the lead, he likes to just kind of hang wide, stay out in the clear, and track the pace. And that is exactly what John Velazquez did in the Travers. I thought Fierceness couldn't get 1.25 miles. Not only did he get 1.25 miles, he traveled 3 wide around both turns while getting 1.25 miles. And again, we're going to show the start here. And they're going to break. He's on the far outside. He's in that number 8 post. And you have Dornick wanting to go, obviously, pretty aggressively. But most importantly, you have Batten Down with Junior Alvarado, who wants to go. Torpedo Anna wants to be pretty forward as well. And you see Fierceness there kind of hanging out in a co-third, fourth position with Torpedo Anna as they go by the wire the first time. And Johnny V is very content to let this horse float out on the track and sit fourth in the early going. Remember, he tracked the pace in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile last year at Santa Anita as well. So I think what's important, though, is that outside post position allows him to get into that comfortable spot going into the first turn. If Fierceness draws the inside rail, that's a problem, I would say, because then it's going to force the issue a little bit more. It's going to maybe force him to try to go up to the front, challenge Arthur's Ride, a horse like that up on the front end. That could be an issue. Now, as I said, he finished strong in that race, went wide around both turns, yet turning for home. You see the Rapoli Silks. He gets out there up on the front end, and he is able to spurt clear by 2 or 3 lengths here in the lane until Torpedo Anna makes her run. You see Sierra Leone on the outside making his run, as he always does. But it's Torpedo Anna that really challenges him the most. And Fierceness digs down. And listen, I don't know if he wants an inch over 1.25 miles, but he managed to get the 1.25 miles. And a very impressive victory there, being able to hold off Torpedo Anna coming down the stretch. Like I said, we will see if this is what he can do in the Breeders' Cup Classic. I think he is very post-dependent. I think the further outside he draws, the more beneficial that will be. It will allow Velazquez to slide him over going down the front stretch the first time and kind of sit that very similar trip he sat in the Travers. If he draws inside, again, I think he might be a little bit of a toss in that regard, just because we've not seen Fierceness deal with adversity and kickback in that way. And that could be a major issue. And when you look at it, when he's run his best, it's been when he's had kind of the perfect trip. Now, John Velazquez basically said after the Travers, we've kind of figured this horse out. We just let him do what he wants to do. That's easier said than done. And it's easier said when you draw an advantageous post position. If you're on the inside, you're going to be asked to do some things you might not be comfortable doing. We'll see if he's able to respond. The talent is undeniable. The speed figures are incredibly high. And if they did finally figure him out, my gosh, maybe he can continue to improve at this rate. We know he can ship out to the West Coast. I probably will be playing against him. I think that he is a horse that is incredibly talented. But I don't know what price you're going to get. I think it's going to be a pretty low price on Fierceness in all likelihood. And he's one that certainly has more than enough talent to win this race on his best day. I do wonder if at 1.25 miles with a little bit more pressure against older horses for the first time, whether or not he's able to get the job done. Like I said, I think the post draw on Monday is so critical to see how he draws in this race. I think the further outside he draws, the better. The more inside he draws, I'm more concerned. And if you were a backer of Fierceness, I'd be a little bit more worried on the inside 3 or 4 post positions. If he draws 7 through maybe 13, that kind of, depending on how big the field ends up actually being, if he draws kind of more on the outside, and if he draws outside of a horse like Arthur's Ride, I think that makes him a lot more formidable in this spot. All right, folks, we're going to wrap it up there for this Breeders' Cup Classic Spotlight Series on Fierceness. Make sure to press that like and subscribe button. We got a Classic Contenders spotlights for all of the other major horses in this race coming throughout the week, as well as capping the card, long shots, and so much more. Like I said, it's Breeders' Cup week. I hope you guys enjoy all the content. My name is Matthew DeSantis, wishing you a great and prosperous day at the races, and reminding you, friends, it's now post time.